Y'all know I love annotating, and ever since I made my original How to Annotate video a few years ago, I've been meaning to make a bit of a follow-up, bonus material, additional content video where I take you along with me from beginning to end, annotating a book, and really get into the nitty-gritty, explain how I approach it through all the stages of reading a book so that you can understand on an even deeper level my system and how I use it and why I do it the way I do, past some of the more brief or surface level examples I could give in that video. Despite the fact that I tried to give so many examples, there was only so much I could do. So this video hopefully will be even more helpful for any of you who are either newer to the system or are still feeling a little overwhelmed or hesitant or just still have questions. I hope this video will answer those questions for you and just help inspire you or motivate you or make you feel ready to take on annotation in your own reading life if it's something you want to try. I'll link the original annotation video in the description box if you want to give it a watch, whether you watched it when it first came out and now it's been a few years, or if you've never seen it, so that you can learn all the basics of my system and all the different terminology and what it means, because I don't want to spend too much time explaining the basics and repeating myself. I'd rather get into all those nitty-gritty details and try to answer the many questions that I still get on that video every single month. This video is kindly sponsored by Squarespace. I'll talk about them a little more later in the video, but for now, let's just get into the very first initial steps that I take when I'm starting a new book and I know that I plan to annotate it. The book I'm going to be reading and annotating in this video as our example is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a classic, and it's actually the first book that I'm reading for my brand new Read It or Unhaul It challenge, which is very exciting as I try to read all the books on my physical TBR. So this was the first book my wheel landed on. So I'll explain the initial few steps that I take when I am starting a new book and the ones that I have already taken with this one. First of all, I still am using the same creativity case from Archer and Olive to hold my books that I am currently reading and annotating. I also have another slightly larger fabric case from Archer and Olive that I like to use as well. Just depends on my mood and which one I feel like using at the time. The other one fits a few more books in it at once. This one can fit 2. That one can fit a few more depending on the size of the book and how much I'm willing to squish. But you definitely don't need a case of this kind, but I just like that I can keep all my supplies together in one place and not have to have a bunch of separate things. I would rather be able to carry the book within my pencil case, essentially, instead of having a separate pencil case and trying to carry it with my book. But that's just me. The very first things I do when I'm starting a brand new book that I know I want to annotate is decide first and foremost whether I'm going to annotate in my traditional way, which is writing directly on the pages, or if I'm going to annotate in my non-destructive way. For whatever reason, whether it's a vintage book that I'm wary of writing in, or if it's a special edition or maybe it's a book that I have an inkling I'm not going to enjoy, so I'd rather not write directly in it so that it's easier for me to donate it or put it in my little free library for someone else to enjoy. I take a few moments to try to decide how I'm going to annotate the book before I move forward. In this case, I'm hoping I'm going to love this book, and because it's a classic, I know I'm going to want to annotate it more thoroughly than some other genres to make sure that I get as much out of it as possible. So I know I'm going to write directly in it. I knew I would need at least one highlighter and pen, my preferred types. Again, everything's linked in the description box, and I go into detail into my favorite supplies in the original video, but I make sure that I have at least one of each and that they still work and haven't dried out since the last time I used them, if it's been a little while. Usually I like to have at least one backup of each in my creativity case as well, just so that I have them right there if they do run out of ink while I'm in the middle of annotating. So I stock up, make sure I have my pen and highlighter. I also make sure that I have some tabs. And at this point, I'll choose what tab colors I want to use. In this case, I'm just going to use these light pastel tabs. My priority with tabs is really that I have enough different colors that are distinct from each other so that it's easy to see which is which, so that I can have an extensive key as I'm annotating. And sometimes to facilitate that, because I do find that some tab collections have at least a few colors that are similar enough that they're really hard to distinguish when they're not directly next to each other. So for example, these two light pinks look different here, but when they're actually used as tabs in the book, they're pretty hard to distinguish just by eye, or at least they are for me. Same with these light greens. So I personally, when I'm tabbing, use these as the same color, which might mean that I need a few more colors, in which case I pretty much always have some other tabs, especially old packs that I used for other books where I have some colors left over. They're almost always going to be in my creativity case because I don't like to waste anything. I don't throw away extra tabs. If there are any left over, I keep them to use in later books. So I have these here. The other thing I do right at the start is grab a sticky note and put it on the back of my tab holder. And that is going to be where I write my key as I go along. And while I'm annotating, I will use this as my bookmark. So I have my tabs and my key anywhere I am in the book, and I don't need to have another bookmark on hand. Now, you might think that the next thing I would do is start my key, start assigning colors, but I don't do that right away. The only exception is that I occasionally will assign a color to quotes right off the bat, because I always assign a color to quotes, no matter what I'm reading, no matter the genre, no matter the type of book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I always track quotes. That is the only thing that is always consistent. So depending on my mood and the day, I might assign a color to quotes right away, or I might wait until I come across the first quote I want to tab and then assign a color to it at that point. I have been annotating for long enough and using enough of the same colored tabs that I have started using certain colors to mean certain things as a shorthand, mostly just because it's easier for my mind when I pick up an old book that I've already annotated to automatically recognize that it's likely most of the time that yellow is for quotes and pink is going to be something to do with characters and green is going to be world building or magic system related if those apply. I do like to have some consistency in my tab colors, but you don't have to do that if it isn't something that appeals to you. And I don't always do it. And that's why keys are useful, because I don't always use the same colors to mean the same things. And as I mentioned in that original video, I'm not always tracking the same things. Every book is different and I approach every book as an individual. So there's one more thing that I tend to do when I start a book, which is mark any important areas of the book with a tab along the top, and also mark the quarter point, halfway point, and 3/4 point. As for important pages to mark, that would be where an introduction starts, where a map of the world is. If there are endnotes, as there are in this edition of North and South, I will mark that. In this edition, there's a chronology at the beginning, so that's also something that I would mark in case I needed to refer to it. For any of these elements that I might want to refer to throughout my read, I like to tab them at the top so they're easy to find, and I'll pick one consistent color for those as I go. In this case, I'm choosing this light green. And then, as I said, I'll also mark the 25%, 50%, and 75% mark roughly of the book. This is just something that helps me personally. I like to have a reference of where I am in the book and how far through I am, especially if I'm reading a book as part of a reading vlog, because I do like to check in at the halfway point. I personally like to put those tabs on an angle at the top corner to distinguish them from areas that I might want to refer back to. So now when I look at my book, I can very quickly see a quarter, half, and 3/4 of the way through, and where I am in relation to those based on wherever I have my bookmark, like so. And I can also see any areas that I might want to refer to, like the chronology or the notes at the back. At this point, I'm ready to start annotating. I've done all my prep work. So let me take you along with me as I read and annotate North and South, and hopefully this will be a helpful exercise and a really good in-depth example of what I do for any of you who are getting into annotating. Let's go. Hello, my friends. This is future me, having finished North and South, annotated the entire book. And I'm here to do a flip through of literally every single page so you get a full understanding of how much I annotated versus how many pages I didn't. I want to give you transparency, the whole picture of what a completely annotated book by yours truly looks like. I think that's the most helpful way that I could approach this video, so that's what we're going to do. Let's get started. Without further ado, there are a lot of pages to flip through. So, opening up the book here. Here we have the key that I used throughout, and as you can see, I crossed some things out, reassigned some things. We'll get there. I'm going to pull this out for now. I will eventually transfer this from the sticky note to the inner page here. I'll just write out each category with the tab next to it, so it's more permanent, but that's something I do at a later date, usually. So the book starts with some extra bonus things, chronology, the introduction that I didn't read before reading the book because they usually have spoilers in my experience. So we're just going to skip past this because I have not read it yet, although I plan to. So I have no annotations. There's also a further reading section and note on the text. Then we get to where the book properly starts, and this is where I started reading. So we have the contents and then this little note from the author, which I also read. And then we get into the first chapter here. So my first annotation on this page, I just found this funny and relatable. This is talking about how Edith is concerned about keeping a piano in good tune and that she considers it to be one of the most formidable difficulties that could befall her in her married life, which I just found funny and relatable because I play piano. My husband bought me a piano as a gift for my last birthday, and he is our resident piano tuner. And because it's a piano that's over a century old, it requires a lot of tuning, and I just found this hilariously relatable to me. So I tabbed it, and then I wrote a note here, relatability that transcends time, LOL. And originally my tab here was pink, and my initial thought was to tab this for Edith-related things, but as you'll see later, I changed my mind about keeping tabs on Edith. Pun very much intended, because she is not as prominent a figure in this book as I first thought in reading the first page of this book, which honestly is one of the most important lessons, I think, when it comes to annotating. Be flexible. Be willing to change things, especially if you're annotating books you haven't read before. You don't know where the story's going. You don't know what's going to happen. A character could be killed off at any moment or just not be as relevant as you think they will be. Certain themes could feel very important in the first chapter and then not ever come up again. Something really important could be introduced to the story 75% of the way through. You never know what's going to happen, so just stay flexible. Allow yourself to change your mind. Here I used a new tab color to mark the use of outdated, potentially offensive language here. I like to try to track this in the books I read, especially specifically classics that tend to have a lot of outdated, potentially offensive or upsetting language, because I will add outdated language or potentially offensive language to the content warnings. And if someone asks me for specifics, I like to be able to go back and have a reference to every one I notice so I can give them a thorough list. So that's something I do specifically because I am a content creator and I try to be responsible about how I talk about books, how I recommend them. So I added a tab color for that. Then here there was another section I wanted to highlight. This is just a joke about our main character's Aunt Shaw, who was constantly, though quietly, bemoaning her hard lot in being united to one whom she could not love. And there's just something very dry and funny to me about this description, about the way this was written. So I highlighted this section and then underlined and emphasized the parts of the sentence that I found funniest. And then I added a new tab color, this gray, for funny moments, which, as you can see, I eventually came back and swapped out this one that was light pink for Edith originally to being gray for funny. Then lower down on the same page, another highlight, just another funny moment. So I just wrote LOL beside it. And I didn't add a new tab because there's already a funny tab on this page. And that's something I do in general. I won't use the same color tab twice on one 2-page spread. I'll just use it once to reference that this spread has things that fit under that tab. Usually it only takes me a moment to identify why I highlighted or underlined something on a page, so extra tabs are not necessary. Here we get a little bit more of Margaret's backstory, so I added a tab here for tracking Margaret, our protagonist. Here we get some blatantly and irritating to me misogynistic dialogue, and so I felt the need to highlight it and comment on it, talking about how ladies' business is so very different to men's business, and, you know, women are playing with shawls, which is very different work to what the serious men do. And then I just have a little note about how I feel my eyes rolling and the misogyny is going to be hard to handle in this book, and I added a new tab here to track misogyny. And I personally usually have a lot to say and want to argue with the book about it as I read. It helps me to process my frustration. So I added a tab for that as well. And at this point, I added these tabs and their labels to my key. Pink for Edith, which again, I changed later, dark blue for outdated language, gray for funny, and this red color for Margaret. And on the next page here, there was another funny moment, so I just added a tab to track that. In this case, it's Margaret saying that she's never thought much about her wedding and is trying to shade her cousin Edith for getting overly carried away with her wedding. But then she spends a whole paragraph describing exactly how she'd want her wedding to be. So just a little irony there. On the next page here, there was a little bit of commentary on marriage, and I'd seen that already coming up quite a bit through this first chapter, so I added a new tab color to potentially track the different ways that this book would portray marriage. And then another funny moment here about Mrs. Shaw feeling herself to be really hard done by. Just funny characterizations of her, and you can just feel the sarcasm dripping from Gaskell as she writes these passages. So just another funny tab there. And then we come to the end of the first chapter. There was another misogynistic moment here, so I tabbed that as well. And then I just wrote some thoughts on the first chapter. I don't write a summary or write my thoughts at the end of every single chapter, but I do usually like to write a few sentences of thoughts at the end of the first chapter or first couple chapters in a book, just to have a record of my initial thoughts as I started it. So in this case, it's just, I like it well enough so far, but am a bit worried that Margaret will be very not like other girls, and that anything traditionally feminine will be viewed in a negative light. I hope I'm wrong about that. We'll find out together. If I'm wrong about that. Okay, getting into chapter 2, we start having some evidence of wealth and class disparity between different characters in the story. And considering the little bit that I knew about this book getting into it, I had an assumption that this would be an ongoing theme in a variety of ways. So I did add a new tab color, this light blue, for tracking wealth and class disparity. And then here, another quote to do with marriage dynamics. So I used my sort of teal colored tab again. And I highlighted this quote here, "Married for love, what can dearest Maria have to wish for in this world?" From Mrs. Shaw, who thinks her sister marrying someone poor for love is the best possible outcome, while Maria is looking at her sister who married for money and never had love and being envious of her life. The grass is always greener. Here, didn't have much to say, obviously, until I got to the end of the second page here, started highlighting some more characterization of Margaret. I'm starting to get an inkling, as you can see here, and I have more thoughts to share, that there's a little bit of an unflattering portrayal of Margaret going on, which I hope is just setting her up for some serious character growth throughout the story, because she is being portrayed as very full of herself, very prideful, and a bit self-centered. I did like this quote here, but the cloud never comes in that quarter of the horizon from which we watch for it. So I had highlighted that and then also underlined it and added a yellow tab. Yellow is traditionally my quotes color, and it was again this time. A red tab for Margaret, because so much of this is giving some more characterization for Margaret, including this passage here. In the general happiness of the recollection of those times, she had forgotten the small details which were not so pleasant. Her rose-colored glasses for her home. Helstone was at some distance from any neighbors of their own standard of cultivation. Again, just a little note of her classism, which we get into down here as well, and I used my classism tab for some of this ongoing stuff, which is both characterization for Margaret and a starting point for her, a good place to grow from, but also really digging into this theme of classism and your own kind of people that you want to associate with, and the class stratification in England at the time. This feels like a rather unflattering depiction of someone used to luxury who maintains a sense of superiority based on a hypothetical ability to abstain that is never tested. So basically, what I'm saying is Margaret is going on about how, yes, she's lived in luxury, but she knows very well that she could go without it, unlike some other people. And she's using that as a way to lift herself above others when, again, it's never been tested for almost as long as she can remember. She's lived in luxury and had anything she wanted, so how does she know? At this point, I'm hoping that this is just setting her up for some serious growth as a character, because she is quite young at the start of this book. She's 18. This is, as you can see, a little bit more of a heavily annotated page. Lots of stuff that I had thoughts on in terms of the character development and the start of digging into this theme or this idea of class separation, wealth disparity, respectability, etc. And then here I highlighted another quote. This was just something I found quite lovely in the descriptive language. It was very evocative. So I didn't add another tab. I wasn't sure at this point if I wanted to have a tab for just lovely language, which I sometimes do separate from quotes, and sometimes I just kind of keep them combined. And then some more discussion of marriage dynamics in this paragraph. So I used my marriage tab again. Moving on to the final spread of this chapter, and I have another highlighted section here, again to do with marriage. And here you can see I did a little bit more of an intensive annotation with circling certain words, underlining, just to really emphasize the portions of this quote that I found most relevant to myself. The quote is, "Dixon had always considered Mr. Hale as the blight which had fallen upon her young lady's prospects in life. If Miss Beresford had not been in such a hurry to marry a poor country clergyman, there was no knowing what she might not have become. But Dixon was too loyal to desert her in her affliction and downfall," which is also very dramatic. And then I just have a note here, rather dramatic, don't you think? There you go. "Disadvantageous marriages and class seem prominent so far." So again, just a note on what I'm picking up on and how I'm feeling about what I'm reading so far. And that brings us to the end of chapter 2. Before we get into chapter 3, a couple things. First of all, I'm not going to be talking as in-depth in detail about every single page, because otherwise this video will be hours long. I'm not going to read every highlighted portion and every single one of my notes. You can pause and try to read my handwriting if you want for a lot of these. But I also wanted to just note at this point that I tend to find that in the first couple chapters, in the first quarter of a book, let's say, I tend to annotate much more heavily and have more to say and highlight more, because most books are still sort of setting the scene. They're introducing you to the main cast of characters. They're introducing the themes. They're telling us about the setting, the time, the place. There's just a lot of building the foundations for the story, and I find I tend to have more to track and say at this point. Once you get into the middle of a book, I often have less to say on a page-by-page basis, and then once you get to the end, I sometimes have a lot more again as things start to wrap up, so just a note there. Also, as you've already seen, there are some pages where I don't have anything to say and I don't tab anything, and that's totally fine and normal, even at the start of a book when I do tend to generally have more. So getting into chapter 3, I really liked this intro quote here from Mrs. Browning, and it felt like it was hinting at some things to come in the story, so I just reflected a little bit on that. And I started from this point paying much more attention to these opening quotes because I started to realize how relevant they were to the chapter that was to follow. And originally I tabbed this opening quote with a brand new color because I had a feeling that maybe there would be quite a bit of discussion of love and early courtship in this book. But I quickly changed my mind and realized I wanted to save that tab for something else to have more options, and decided to put under the heading of marriage and marriage dynamics the idea of courtship and love as well. Just really all relationship dynamics and the different examples that we're getting throughout the book. And here I'm just using tabs that I've already used. My marriage tab, my funny tab, adding notes like, is he trying to flirt, LOL? And then the next line, she's not picking up on it. Using my tab for class disparity and adding some more notes and highlights here about how that's being done and how it's being talked about. Here I added a brand new tab, this light green, to start tracking discussion about Hellstone. I thought maybe it would be nice for the South, for Hellstone specifically, to have its own color, and started to pick up on there being perhaps a little bit of a mystery to do with Hellstone. There was something going on that we didn't know the full picture of as we get more into this chapter. And so I really felt like I needed a tab color specifically for that. It always represented sort of the vibe, the feeling of being in the South, the dynamic of Hellstone and the surrounding areas, more country life, but it also grew and expanded to cover religious concepts and concepts of faith, because Margaret's father is a parson and faith is sort of a big part of his story and of the entire story in a variety of ways. So I did add a new tab for that. Here, as you can see, again, I had a lot to highlight and say. Some more marriage dynamics here, some more more Margaret development here, a little bit more to do with the dynamics in the South and just my various notes. And sometimes my notes are more serious and sometimes they're more reactionary and casual. So this one is, he seems concerned about her, cute, exclamation point. And this one is, he's losing his cool, aw, and a little heart. Whereas sometimes they are much more serious and critical. He's just happy to be here, LOL. Not every note has to be brilliant and a, brand new thesis. Next page here, we have a bit more marriage dynamics, a little bit more with the class disparity. We're getting a lot of insight in these pages into Henry and his feelings about Margaret, so I am adding lots of tiny little notes about how I feel about their dynamic and about how things are progressing and about the sort of cross purposes where they aren't always understanding each other super clearly. I'm using a tab for Margaret because we're learning a little bit more about her and how she's reacting to this new scenario, and still continuing to use my tab for love and marriage and courtship and all of the above. Here we get a bit of a dramatic scene, so I'm annotating quite a bit and reacting to how very dramatic it is. And right to the end of the chapter where things escalate even further in the drama, the melodrama, really, to be honest, department. Just some more thoughts, there's definitely something mysterious happening in Hellstone, so I really committed to light green being a color to track that at this point, but also so much insight into Margaret. Honestly, at this point, her lack of knowledge of herself, her lack of self-awareness, and a lot to do with courtship, marriage dynamics. We may or may not get a marriage proposal in this chapter. Moving into chapter 4 here, first page is just kind of continuing on the aftermath of what happened at the end of the last chapter. So I didn't use any new tabs because it's still really mostly more insight into Margaret and her reaction to said proposal. Also my hypothesizing after reading the little intro poem. Here we're getting a little bit more lead up to something mysterious, maybe starting to learn what's going on in Hellstone and with her father, so using that tab there. And that keeps progressing throughout this chapter, so I keep using that same light green tab to track it and occasionally reacting here. As you can see, no highlights or underlines or anything on this spread, but I did have some thoughts to add in the margin. And here's some more marriage dynamics stuff and some more class disparity, heavy judgment going on there. Again, just more of the same tab colors here, class disparities and judgment of who they consider to be below them on the hierarchy, more development of Margaret as a character, and more discussion of this situation with her father and Hellstone and religion and faith in general. And at the end of that chapter, I definitely had some thoughts about her father's attitude and behavior, so I wrote a couple sentences there. I'm going to start flipping through a little bit faster here, mostly just so you can see how much was annotated and what tab colors I was using. If I have something to comment on, I will. Obviously, more notes here. We're learning more and more about Margaret at this point, and I'm not liking everything I was seeing, so I am reacting quite a bit. A little more misogyny on this page. More about Margaret, more of her judging people from different circumstances than her, even though she is not wealthy herself or her individual family. More Margaret here. And getting into chapter 6, really loved this Tennyson quote at the start of this chapter, so I highlighted it all and added a quote tab. Also some lovely descriptions throughout this chapter really about moving away, leaving home, and sort of that wistfulness and the emptiness you feel as you start to pack up and see your home through new eyes or in a new light as you leave. Another lovely quote here. She leant back and shut her eyes, and the tears welled forth and hung glittering for an instant on the shadowing eyelashes, before rolling slowly down her cheeks and dropping unheeded on her dress. Some grief and moving on and growing pains in this chapter. I added a highlight and a note here. I didn't have any particular tab here, which is interesting. I might have thought that I would come back and add a tab that was relevant, but honestly, I don't feel like this concept was really explored too much. In particular, this was really about the concept of fair weather friends. This is more of a one-off quote or thought that the author had. So I'm just now going to add a yellow tab here, which is a different shade of yellow, but I'm using both shades of yellow to mean quotes in this book. I'll just add that now so that it's properly tabbed in future. Moving on to chapter 7 here, a little bit of a change of scenery, as you can see from the title of the chapter, New Scenes and Faces. And here, a new tab color again. Also, you might notice that a lot of my tabs have cat hairs trapped underneath them. There is no avoiding that. That's just my life. But I added this sort of peachy color to represent the north. We have light green for the south, and we have peachy for the north. And they both have sort of dual meanings as we learn more about what the north and south represent in terms of the themes of the story. Oh yeah, sorry, I'm gonna read this one just because it's funny. I could have also used a funny tab here, which I didn't, but maybe I will now. Might as well. I don't normally go through and look at every single annotation when I finish a book, at least not right away. So, but you know, this is an opportunity because I tabbed this for Margaret. I am overpowered by the discovery of my own genius for management. Is Margaret talking about herself, and I just said, LOL, okay girl. To be fair, she's 18. Using more of the same tabs here, more character development, exploration of where Margaret is at this point, a little more judgment of people from different backgrounds. There's a lot of that at the start of this book especially, but really throughout. Lots more about Margaret here. She also meets Mr. Thornton at this point, and he's not sure he's a fan of our Miss Margaret. And I just wrote here, I don't like her much either, Mr. T. Little did I know how the tables would turn. Then, finishing off the chapter, had some thoughts at the end, comparing and contrasting Margaret's good breeding, in quotes, and poverty with Mr. Thornton's commonness but wealth. Will they fall in love? I'm getting a feeling, ellipses. Getting into chapter 8, some marriage dynamics there between her parents, some more class disparity. As you can see, I haven't written any notes for this chapter so far. Just soaking it in and adding relevant tabs when they come up. Same thing on this spread, some misogyny, some class disparity, a little more Margaret development. My first highlight of this chapter is a quote, and yet, you see, North and South has both met and made kind of friends in this big smoky place. Love a little reference to the title in the text, and we get to the end of the chapter, and I just added a little note on my thoughts. Didn't have much to say while reading the chapter, but as I said here, I'm glad she's at least trying to make friends. Getting into the next chapter here, again, not as much to say, not highlighting as much, just reading and observing and adding some tabs, and that was a very short chapter. And that's kind of the vibe here for a bit. Starting to highlight a little more here, a little bit of writing. Ooh, love is in the air with these two. Was my really insightful note. Again, not every page is going to elicit 5-paragraph essay on my part, though I did share some thoughts at the very end, which is also something I tend to do, I would say, not every time, but if I read a chapter or a few chapters without having much to say on anything in particular, I might sort of summarize my thoughts at the end, as I did here. And this is really about my changing opinions of Mr. Thornton at this point, from really liking him to side-eyeing him heavily. Again, using all the same tabs that I'd previously established here. Not too many highlights or notes, but a couple. Things continue to be pretty steady annotation-wise. Now that we're getting more into the flow of the story, I'm not stopping to add as many annotations. I'm typically reading a page or so at a time and then going back to highlight or write notes if I feel like it. Sometimes I do read with my highlighter in hand and just highlight as I go, but typically I will read a few paragraphs to a page or two before I go back and make note of whatever jumped out at me. Here, I thought this was a really lovely poetic description, which I wrote here and added my quotes tab. Another quote that I liked here, looking back upon the year's accumulated heap of troubles, Margaret wondered how they had been born. If she could have anticipated them, how she would have shrunk away and hid herself from the coming time. And yet, day by day had, of itself and by itself, been very endurable. Small, keen, bright little spots of positive enjoyment having come sparkling into the very middle of sorrows, which I found very beautiful and relevant to me right now. So I highlighted that as a quote, as a little reminder to myself to keep going and pushing through and focusing on the positive even when things feel hard. And some final thoughts at the end of that chapter. So continuing on in this vein, again, just really, like I said, reading a couple paragraphs to a page at a time, going back to highlight and underline and add tabs as needed. Another quote here, and this one really typifies a major theme of this book and this pink tab that I started using. Both this first section, I am glad of it. I am prouder of Frederick standing up against injustice than if he had been simply a good officer. And then here, this quote as well, loyalty and obedience to wisdom and justice are fine. But it is still finer to defy arbitrary power unjustly and cruelly used, not on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of others more helpless. It was around this point, I believe, that I started realizing that it was going to be pretty pointless to have a tab color for Edith if things continued the way they were going. So I did end up going back and changing that first pink tab to gray for funny. I decided to reassign it. What did I say here? Define arbitrary power on behalf of those more helpless. So sort of tangentially attached to the idea of the North in general, which is peach, and it's the North, but also industry and this different way of life in the factories and coming in because of the Industrial Revolution. The pink tab is specifically the viewpoint that things should not be so profit-driven and so capitalistic, but more focusing on the humanity of the workers, workers' rights, unions, fair compensation, safety and health regulations, etc., and sort of standing up for those who need your help and doing the right thing, regardless of whether you have any stake in the matter, and also sort of standing up to power or using your own inherent privilege or power to stand up for those less fortunate. Some more little impressions, thoughts, reactions. For example, here they're describing Mrs. Thornton coming in and she's wearing all white in a room that is decorated with a lot of white. And I was just adding a note that wearing white was a sign of wealth, especially in a factory town, in an industrial town where there's a lot of smoke and pollution. Keeping everything looking fresh and white all the time takes money and effort and time and servants. And it's a sign of how wealthy they are that they can manage to drape themselves in white fabrics in that kind of an environment. Lots more thoughts here. We're getting a much deeper look into Thornton's perspective on his industry and his role in industry versus the workers' roles and who gets to be wealthy and successful and who doesn't. And I had a lot of things to say because I did not agree with his perspective. I found it quite despicable, to be honest. So I have many little thoughts in this section as he talks about how his workers are essentially infants who need an autocrat to lead them. I also loved this note from Margaret, and I'm starting to like Margaret a lot more in these conversations as she's pushing back against some of these capitalist ideas. Because you are a man dealing with a set of men over whom you have, whether you reject the use of it or not, immense power, just because your lives and your welfare are so constantly and intimately interwoven. When I see men violent and obstinate in pursuit of their rights, I may safely infer that the master is the same, that he is a little ignorant of that spirit which suffereth long, and is kind, and seeketh not her own. And a Drag Race reference in the notes, because I am a woman of culture. Get him, Jade. If you know, you know. And some final thoughts at the end of that chapter, because it was very interesting in terms of exploring the themes when it comes to workers' rights, capitalism, etc., but also infuriating because Mr. Thornton's ideas were quite despicable to me personally. A completely untabbed, unhighlighted, ununderlined page. These do exist sometimes. Still using all the same quotes here. I also felt like this was great. Who doesn't like this strike? Who's a deal too much set on peace and quietness at any price? And this quote specifically reminded me of a Martin Luther King speech where he talks about the white moderate and their focus on peace and tranquility over progress and justice. It's a great speech if you don't know that one, but that's what that quote reminded me of, and I thought it was fantastic, and I feel like it ties into the themes really well, so I wanted to highlight that there. Just some more areas to highlight and comment on here to do with Margaret and some of these themes of workers' rights. This has quite a bit on religion and the Bible, which I am not an expert in as an atheist, you know, tabbed nonetheless. Again, some long passages about religion. We are introduced to a character at this point who is pretty obsessed with one specific book of the Bible, so there's a lot of religion talk, Bible talk. And as you can see now, as we're approaching, getting closer to the middle of the book, I'm not annotating nearly as heavily unless it's really developing the characters or the themes, and that is totally normal for me anyway. So don't beat yourself up or don't feel like you're doing it wrong somehow if you're going several pages or even chapters without really annotating anything. That's normal. I mean, and by normal, I mean there is no normal. You can do it however you want. I find it normal. It's something that comes up for me a lot, even as someone who annotates quite heavily, I would say, in general. Not every page is going to be heavily annotated, and that's fine. Still using all the same tabs for all the same things, and actually at this point, I believe my tabs had reached their final form, so I didn't add any new tab colors, and I didn't change the definitions or the meanings of any of these tabs at this point, which honestly is a bit unusual. I would say it's probably more common that I would change some things even past the 50% mark, but not in this case. Couple highlights and notes here after a while of only using tabs. So much drama. This is a very dramatic chapter, so things are starting to get more exciting. Not too much going on here other than tabbing relevant things. As you can see, like I said, middle of the book, usually I find I've written a lot of what I have to say about various themes and characters unless something specifically super dramatic comes up. Also depends on my mood as well. Of course, if I'm reading super late at night or early in the morning before my coffee's kicked in, I might have less to say. But as you see, things always come back around again. I always end up with more thoughts. And this note is, Freud would have a field day with Mrs. Thornton. Her son, her pride, her property. The new love was displacing her already from her place as first in his heart. A terrible pain, a pang of vain jealousy shot through her. Yeah, just very dramatic. And then this page made me laugh so hard, oh my god, to the point where I added a funny tab at the top, which you know is serious. It means I want to be able to refer back to this as one of the best examples of whatever that tab is in the book, because here Mr. Thornton is very upset, but he's upset in a way that any man would be upset. He's not upset in a feminine way. That would be even more embarrassing. He says, "No one loves me, no one cares for me but you, mother." He turned away and stood leaning his head against the mantelpiece, tears forcing themselves into his manly eyes. And my note is, this is so funny, WTF. Why so dramatic? LOL, his manly eyes. Okay, LOL, sure, Jan. Just over the top drama and so silly. Once again, I say, sure, Jan. Now that I'm halfway through the book, I just wanted to jump on here to chat about something that really bothered me when I first started annotating and might be a point of struggle for you as well. So I just wanted to quickly talk about it, which is that not every single chapter, every page, every section of a book is going to call to you in the same way, is going to require the same level of annotation. And I have found it to be the case that in most books, there is at some point, if not at multiple points, a lull where maybe it's more plot driven and it's just event after event. Maybe I am just not as interested in the events of a few chapters. Maybe the author is, getting sidetracked by something that is not as relevant to the main character development or the themes, or at least the themes that I'm most engaged with. So don't beat yourself up or don't feel like you're doing something wrong somehow if there are pages or full chapters or even longer where you really don't annotate very much. If you go from writing little notes in the margins on pretty much every single page to only adding 1 or 2 tabs for 4 or 5 chapters, that doesn't mean that you're no longer engaged or you're doing something wrong or you've stopped annotating your book. That ebb and flow is natural. It's normal. Let it happen. Don't beat yourself up about it. Don't hold yourself to some impossible standard. I'm not annotating to the same extent on every single page. And there are sometimes, like I said, chapters where I just don't have much to say. And whether that's something that sits with me and how I'm feeling as I read those chapters or my, lack of anything to add to what's happening in those chapters, or if that has more to do with the book and what it is or isn't delivering in those chapters, I'm not too worried about it, to be honest. Again, it's an ebb and flow. Not every page, not every line of a book is as important as every other. There are sections of books that just have to move the plot along or remind us that another character exists so that we're not shocked when they show up in a later chapter to do something really important. Sometimes the author really wants to talk about something, go on a little side quest that you find completely irrelevant or uninteresting as the reader, and that's fine. That can happen even in great books, you know. I would say that generally great books do have ebbs and flows naturally and give the reader moments of respite from really being incredibly engaged and immersed in the themes and the struggle and the emotional turmoil. You know, you want to give your readers sort of those peaks and the valleys to recover, and then a peak again and then another valley. So anyway, all this to say, it is normal. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say. I'm really enjoying annotating this so far. Definitely, as with most books that I annotate, feel that I was annotating quite a bit more heavily in the first quarter of the book or so, and then getting into the middle section, things lighten up a bit, with the exception of the occasional chapter that really moves things along, either with the themes or with character development. And then I would imagine that this will be like many other books that I've read and annotated, where as we get closer to the end, as we reach the climax, I will have a lot to say again. So just riding the wave and going with the flow. Hopefully this has been at the very least interesting to you so far. Hopefully it's helpful. Before I go off and finish North and South though, I did want to briefly talk about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is an all-in-one website platform that I have personally been using for many, many, many years at this point, and I love it. I stand behind it. I recommend it to anyone I know in my life who needs a website. I have found it so incredibly easy to use while also giving me such a professional result that I can feel proud of, especially with my new website redesign. I know I already talked about it, but I'm still so proud of it. I sometimes pull up my website on my phone just so I can admire it for a moment. That's how happy I am with it. And that is all thanks to Squarespace and their amazing design tools, which they're constantly working on to make them as easy to use as possible while still giving you the flexibility you want to build a website that is absolutely perfect for you, both aesthetically and design-wise, but also functionally to serve what you need out of a website. If you need to build a brand new website from scratch, Squarespace is absolutely the place to go with their brand new design intelligence, which is all about combining decades of industry knowledge and design expertise with the power of AI to help you create a personalized website that is perfectly tailored to your needs. Squarespace is also the best place to build your website if you're wanting to sell products, whether they be digital or physical. It is so easy to get started with Squarespace payments. Just a few clicks and you're ready to receive payments right away. Plus, Squarespace gives you so many options so you can pass that on to your customers and give them flexibility in how they pay. Whether it's Afterpay, ClearPay, Klarna, Apple Pay, or ACH direct debit, Squarespace Payments has you covered. Whether you're designing a brand new website or just trying to give your website a little makeover, a little facelift like I recently did, Squarespace has amazing templates for every use case or category to give you inspiration to create a website that's both beautiful and functional. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Head to squarespace.com/plantbasedbride or use this QR code to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain with code plantbasedbride. I also love this moment, adding a funny tab. "Oh dear, a drunken infidel weaver," said Mr. Hale to himself in dismay. I just loved the "oh dear" and also the description of this character as a drunken infidel weaver. Very funny to me. Also here, some great conversation about faith from different perspectives, which I enjoyed and I had some notes about, but also I didn't realize that this saying, put it in your pipe and smoke it, was this old, from the 1850s. So I commented on that because that surprised me. Some commentary on the very saccharine religious faith belief-based talk here, which just doesn't align with my own personal view on the world as an atheist. Margaret can be a bit sanctimonious in this book, I would say, from my perspective anyway. I did love this quote at the end of this chapter, though, possibly a bit of a spoiler if you haven't read this book, so maybe I won't read it out loud and you can read it if you want on the screen, and don't read it if you haven't read this book yet, because it'll spoil you. But I really liked this quote, despite not being religious myself. It's just quite lovely in the way it's constructed. Lots of thoughts at the end of this chapter because, as I said here, what in the elementary school silent treatment? This man is 30 with multiple question marks because what in the world? Lots of grossness going on here. He resented those words bitterly, proud of the sense of justice which had made him go in every kindness he could offer to her parents. He exulted in the power he showed in compelling himself to face her whenever he could think of any action which might give her father or mother pleasure. It was a stinging pleasure to be in the room with her and feel her presence. He never looked at her, and yet the careful avoidance of his eyes betokened that in some way he knew exactly where, if they fell by chance, they would rest on her. If she spoke, he gave no sign of attention, and yet his next speech to anyone else was modified by what she had said. Sometimes there was an express answer to what she had remarked, but given to an other person as though unsuggested by her. It was the willful bad manners arising from deep offense. So dramatic. I had so many thoughts because this behavior was so deeply immature and petty and gross and icky from a character who is apparently supposed to be a love interest for our dear Margaret, who is in fact growing and changing at this point in the book. She's working on herself. Okay? I think she deserves better at this point. Some more angry thoughts about our male love interest on this page here. Some misogyny coming up here and some offensive, it's a bit of a racist or xenophobic perspective coming up in the way that a character who's been away from England is described. I'll try to go a bit faster. As you can see, fewer annotations, still using my tabs to mark things that might be of interest and relate to the various themes of the story until I have a lot to say when I do. This was a very dramatic passage on our male love interest's part that I found pretty disturbing and also quite misogynistic in tone, which was unpleasant to read. So I had a lot of thoughts. Jesus, he's so dramatic, so magnanimous, our love interest's name. Please save us all from this man, I beg. I'm also in conversation with our protagonist in some of these annotations, begging her to go with someone else other than this main male love interest who is driving me up the wall. The writing is on the wall, though. I already knew at this point what was going to happen, but I wasn't happy about it, and I was complaining liberally in the margins. What are annotations for, if not for complaining? Another reference to the title here, North and South have each getting their own troubles. I was just rereading this to remember what that was about. There's a lot of anti-Irish sentiment in this book, so I also used my tab for outdated language and potentially offensive material to track all the disparaging comments toward the Irish, which unfortunately came up more and more in the second half of the book. Another one here. Not as many annotations here. I will say at this point in the book, I was starting to lose interest, so I was not nearly as engaged. I was finding it to be dragging quite a bit. So I was still tabbing things that were relevant as they came up and occasionally adding a note, but I wasn't nearly as engaged. I did start to get more engaged again. As we got closer to the end of the book, things started to pick up again. It felt like we kind of lost our way for a bit here in the sort of third quarter, I guess. Her Aunt Shaw loved her well in her own quiet way, but she forgets to love the absent, a very common fault. which I thought was funny but also relatable as someone with ADHD. Out of sight, out of mind is a serious thing. Another quote here, he threw himself back in his seat to try with closed eyes to understand how one in life yesterday could be dead today, and shortly tears stole out between his grizzled eyelashes, at the feeling of which he opened his keen eyes and looked as severely cheerful as his set determination could make him. He was not going to blubber before a set of strangers. Not he. I loved this quote, and this was the start of my obsession with Mr. Bell, my favorite character who showed up far too late in this story. As I wrote here, Mr. Bell is too pure for this world, and a little heart, because I love him. As he says here, I would take a live dragon into my house to live if, by hiring such a chaperone and setting up an establishment of my own, I could make my old age happy with having Margaret for a daughter. Which broke my heart a little bit. So sweet. Maybe I'm just... yeah, I don't know. I don't want to get into it. I found him very sweet. I also find him very funny at various points like this one. I'm dreadfully afraid of being tempted at an unguarded moment by the ant. Getting some development of Margaret's character here as she continues to face more hardship and struggle at this point in her life. A little bit of misogyny in how she's being handled, but also some sweet, caring moments from Mr. Bell. Quite a bit of misogyny going on here with Fanny. A lot of misogyny in this book is the way that some of the other characters like Edith and Fanny are written as foils to Margaret, as the traditional silly, simpering, weak-willed feminine women to contrast against Margaret's upstanding, religious, pure as snow, but also practical protagonist, which I just found very off-putting personally. Here we also get our male love interest being deeply misogynistic towards Margaret, which is lots of fun, calling her a beautiful creature, but luckily Mr. Bell calls him out because he's the best. Beautiful creature indeed. Do you speak of her as he would of a horse or a dog? Thank you, Mr. Bell. Some more commentary here on the factories, workers' rights, unions. Just a little bit, though, after many, many pages of basically forgetting that was a theme. And we'll go back to forgetting it for a while, till the end. Just a note of, yeah, right. The final portion of this book is water damage, so it's a little harder to turn the pages. I might try to flip them from the bottom here. This is a return to London, a visit to London. Trying not to spoil anything, but there was a portion of time here that didn't have quite as much to deliver, I would say. Some funny back and forth here between Margaret and Mr. Bell, just reinforcing why he's my favorite, comparing himself to Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Just generally being a lovely man. There was a visit to London. This is a visit to Hellstone. Some moments I liked, like some lovely descriptive language and a little bit of character development for Margaret, but otherwise more of a way to show how far she's come since the last time she was in Hellstone than anything else. Not much in terms of plot or the other themes. It was more of a character development chapter and not even really showing us anything new, but just really making it very clear in practice how much she's changed over these few years. And we're getting close to the end of the book here. Things are ramping up at the end. A couple setup chapters, I would say, and we're starting to kind of bring back some of those initial themes and trying to wrap them up very quickly, which I'm sort of highlighting here as we're being told very rapidly how things have turned out over the last couple of years without actually watching them happen. Having some thoughts about that over here. Another little misogynistic quip from our love interest, just to make us appreciate him even more as we come up to the ending. Some notes here. I did like this quote here. We should understand each other better, and I'll venture to say we should like each other more. If we talk to each other more is essentially what's being implied or said outright there, specifically between employers and employees in this context. And this is the end of the book. It was very abrupt, and I didn't even realize it was the end of the book because there are so many notes at the end that I turned the final page and was absolutely shocked that that was the end and these were the notes. Which my tab doesn't want to stick to because of the water damage. But anyways, I was shocked that this was the end, and I added a little bit of a reaction here. Not a lot of space to write the extensive thoughts I had on this being the very abrupt end. I did find the last couple sentences funny as I tabbed, and there was a little bit of romance, you know, courting, marriage stuff, some character development for Margaret in the last moment there, but really just such a sudden, abrupt ending. And like I pointed out, there were so many chapters near the end there where I had nothing to say. It was all just set up, really. And then suddenly, in the last 2 to 3 chapters, we were getting all this wrap up of themes from earlier in the book that we had just ignored for ages, but really in a very rapid fire way and not nearly as in depth as I personally would have liked, which is part of my issue with this book in general, which I talk about in the review, and that's not what this video is, so I won't get too into it. But that also obviously is impacting how much I'm writing, because if the book isn't giving me very much or is rushing through things, I might not have as much to say, you know. I'm meeting the book where it's at. And then we get into the notes here at the end. I did add a couple tabs to the notes, to some of them that I thought were adding a lot more context to some of the themes that I might want to be able to refer to later, highlighting a couple moments like the fact that the minimum age for children to work in factories was fixed at 9, and the Factory Act of 1844 laid down 6.5 hours as the maximum working day for children under 12. Children as young as 9 working 6.5 hours a day in a factory, which is disturbing. And that is the end of the book. Just a few more notes at the end there, a glossary, and some blank, very water-damaged pages, and that brings us to the end. That is the entirety of my annotation of North and South. Yeah. So as I said, I'm going to be keeping my key in the book so that I don't forget what each of my colors means, but I will eventually, hopefully if I remember before I put this away on my shelf, write these into the inner cover of the book so that it's permanent. Actually, you know what? But I'm going to do it right now. I'd like to overlap my tabs, so as you can see, I can just move them basically as one piece. Where are you going? You gonna help? Okay. Hi, bud. Here. Little floofy boy. Oh, hi. Okay, so I did update the first one just to make it less wordy and a little more clear what I meant. So I just wrote improved workers' rights. Basically for anything, any perspective that's trying to improve the situation is this pink tab. Then we have outdated language for the dark blue, funny for the gray, Margaret is the red, misogyny for dark green, class disparity for the blue, the light blue, marriage and love for the teal, quotes for yellow, the South and religion for the light green, and the North and industry for the peach. Now, I don't really need to hold on to this post-it if I don't want to, but I might just stick it on the opposite page so I have a reference, especially for the ones that changed, because sometimes that's kind of interesting, and I might write on it as well. This is something I don't always do, but it's kind of fun to do sometimes, to write when I actually did this read through and annotated for reference. So I'll do it both on the post-it and on the page itself. I'll just label it as July 2025. The specific dates aren't as important, but so I'll just write it up here. July 2025. And then I have that as reference. If I do reread it later, I could use a different color pen to annotate the same copy so I could see how my opinions change over time, and I could just use the new pen color for any reread underneath. And I have space for other keys if I want to on this page or something, but there we go. That is the entire process of annotating a book from start to finish. I really hope this was interesting or useful or something. entertaining, good company while you read or annotate or do something else in your own free time, whatever it is you use my videos for. Thank you again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Head to squarespace.com/plantbasedbride or use this QR code to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain with code plantbasedbride. This has been a pretty long one, so I'm gonna get going. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.